This is July 21st, 2012. My name is Cheryl Jennings with Channel 7, ABC 7 TV in San Francisco, and I am here with Jane Morrison, whom I knew from KNBR Radio back in the day. And we're here to do an oral history for the California Historical Radio Society. And Jane, it is such a privilege and honor for me to see you, and especially in this format, to talk about your amazing history.
Thank you.
You were telling me that you're not shy about your age, which I love.
I'm 92 years old.
And you were born in a very special year.
I was born in 1920, and I always say that is the year that men finally admitted that women had the right to vote. I'm looking at him.
And that would be Dave, our photographer today.
Well, I was going to tell you about my first day at KNBC, which was April 1st, 1952. And everybody that day at the station was saying, "But," and this is my big but. And they say that and laugh all day long, and I finally found out what it was about. There was a woman who did interviews every morning, and she was talking, and she said in the middle of the interview, "But," and this is my big but. So everybody thought that was pretty funny, because she was rather big. And so they talked about it all day. But I first ought to tell you about, I graduated from college in 1941 as a journalism major, and all the newspapers said, "We don't hire women in news." And that went on for about a year. And then the men went to war in World War II, and they had to hire women. So I was editor of an 8-page daily for 2 years, and then I was editor for Associated Press for 5.5 years. I made $500 a month because I belonged to the newspaper union, and my friends were mostly making $165 a month, and my husband-to-be, who I met a few years later, was making $210 a month for an advertising job that should have paid at least as much as I was being paid. So that was my beginning. From there, I went to, I quit my AP job and came to California because Jack wanted to go to Stanford on the GI Bill. They had tuition free at Stanford, and he got $125 a month to live on. So I gave up my $500 a month job, and when I got out here, being a woman, all I could get was a job as a secretary, $165 a month. So I did that at Stanford Research, and then we came to San Francisco, moved here in 1952, and I went around looking, and they all said, "We don't hire women in news." Came to KNBR, and the news manager was a little smarter. He said, "Well, here's a secretarial job you can have," and I took it. And 2 months later, I was assigned to do publicity, which I did. And then 3 years later, the manager came by and said, "You take shorthand, don't you? We'd like you to be," we had to cut the budget, so we need publicity. You can be the promotion manager and also be secretary to the merchandising manager.
Oh my goodness.
So I went across the street and cried for an hour and came back to work, and continued to work at that until I think in about 1972, Heber Smith had said, "Don't do promotion for a while. I'm trying to readjust the schedule and the DJs." And so I ended up doing public service, because that was suddenly required by the FCC. And then one day I said, "You know, I can't do both." When they wanted to do promotion again, I said, "Can't do both. I could do promotion or public affairs, but not both." And so the next day he hired Isabel Lemon to do promotion, because she had just worked for a private firm, had just done a sensational job for a program on KNBR.
But I do remember, Jane, that you and I and Gimme Parkline all helped organize the first parade for KNBR.
First parade, huh?
Yeah, the very first parade in Pleasanton.
Oh yeah, I remember.
Yeah.
We were over there about 2 or 3 years. Yeah, that was fun.
It was a lot of fun. And I asked Isabel because she said that she had come the year after she organized the second one, but that you had driven the bus on the first one.
Yeah.
And I remember helping in that, and Rosie Allen and I got to be with Heber in the car in the parades. Yeah. That was a lot of fun.
Well, the funny thing is how Cheryl got into radio. She was at City College with the newspaper, and she kept trying to get into radio, and or broadcasting hadn't been able to get in because no one would hire a woman at that time. And so finally she met me in a political meeting.
I was a little reporter for City College.
Yeah, for Jack Morrison for supervisor, my husband. And so she found out I was in radio, and she got very excited. She says, "I've been trying desperately to get a job in radio, and I can't." And I said, "Oh, well, you can come and work for me for free as an intern." So she did. And from that, she moved up quickly, became the news secretary, and then she and Rosie Lee Allen were there. Rosie was a programming secretary, and so they were given the opportunity every Friday midnight to 6 a.m. to be on the air doing news. And they took the tapes from that, and they got jobs elsewhere. Rosie got one with a FM station over on, I forget the name of the streets. I'm 92 this year, you see, so I don't remember everything.
You remember a lot, Jane.
Yeah.
And then I went to work.
And anyway, you went to work for
K101.
K101. Uh-huh. And then you moved up quickly from there, and you've been at KGO-TV for...
Gosh, well, let's see. A couple of years, yeah. But it's not about me. It's about you.
I know, but you did a great job. But anyway, that was the status of women at that time. It wasn't until 1971 that women were hired in the news. Now I went there in '52, having had 9 years of top news experience, but the first time they hired women in news was 1971. The first time a woman could become a salesperson was 1971, because I remember a sales secretary wanted to be a salesperson, and they wouldn't let her do it until 1971. They finally quit, finally gave it. But the reason it happened in '71, some women who worked for NBC News in Washington, D.C. said they weren't paid the same as the men who were doing exactly the same job. So they filed in court, and the judge ruled that they had to be paid the same. So then NBC reviewed everything, including the administrative salaries. So I had called in August saying I would have a big raise to match that. And then President Nixon declared a wage and price freeze. So I did not get the raise in August. And finally, he lifted it in November, and I got the raise. But did NBC make it retroactive to August? No, I don't think so. They just started it in November.
I was telling Heber that it was remarkable to me, as a young woman who couldn't get a job in the industry, to have you working for him, having this powerful woman in this job, not knowing your story, that you had to be a secretary before you could get that job.
Yeah.
So to get the community affairs director job was a big deal.
Yeah.
I think you were the first one in the market.
Maybe. But my first job with the newspaper, I got a secretary to the publisher, because he just got elected district governor of Rotary. Otherwise, he wouldn't have hired me. And I guess when he did, he found out I was capable. So the minute the men went to war, he hired me to edit the paper. That was funny. I was going to... when I came in, I first worked at Stanford, where my husband was going to school for free, at $165 a month as a secretary. And then we moved into San Francisco in 1952. And I went around to all the radio stations and newspapers. We don't hire women in news, they said. So I took a secretarial job at KNBC Radio, and 2 months later I became the publicity manager. And 3 years later the boss came by and said, we'd like you to, do you take shorthand? And I said, oh yeah. He said, well, we'd like you to continue with publicity, be the promotion manager, we had to cut budget, and be secretary to the new merchandising manager. Well, I went across the street and cried for an hour and came back and went to work. And years later, when one of my interns, I'll tell you about that in a minute, when one of my interns got to be the personnel manager, I looked at my record. NBC had given me only 5% raises all those years, even though they'd promote me, and they wouldn't put my new higher title on my personnel record either. And it wasn't until 1971 when the women in Washington sued that I got the big raise.
So you endured a lot of discrimination over your career.
Well, and I didn't know about it. Once I got the job, I didn't worry. But then finally, Heber Smith, who was my manager at one point, decided that I should spend all my time on public affairs, because FC suddenly, the Federal Communications Commission, was suddenly requiring more public affairs programming, and so he hired. He said I should spend all my time on that. And then suddenly he wanted promotion also. So I said I could do promotion or I could do public affairs, but I don't have time to do both. And he hired Isabel Lemon the next day, because she'd just been in a big promotion and done a great job. So then from then on I did public affairs. And then one day I complained about a new editorial writer they'd gotten who was I thought was a little much. And so the program manager came back to me 2 hours later and said, well, the boss said you could be the editorial writer, but we need one for 1 o'clock today.
Oh my goodness.
Fortunately, I was cooking up a letter to the editor from my friend on some issue, so I just turned that into an editorial. That was my first one. Then I wrote editorials, I think 2 a week until I retired in 1987.
Wow. I remember you producing public affairs programs on radio. So
Yes, I did that.
You were one of the first women on the air in radio.
Well, and I organized public affairs people at all the stations, and was head of the Public Affairs Association. And we had a nice group of people from all the stations. That was fun.
But you were able to finally come into your own because you were the boss, and you could control your department, and you were on the air. I mean, you were on the air as a woman.
Not very much. I never did it. I didn't want to be that. I guess my voice is not my specialty. But I was in charge of that. Well, my intern program, I think, was unique because most of the other stations didn't do that. They didn't quite know what to do with an intern. But one young woman came in. Her father worked for an advertising agency, and he was a friend of our boss, Heber Smith, and so her father asked Heber to take her, that we take her as an intern, and we did. And I've forgotten her name right now, but she went on to be a TV news reporter in Washington, in New York City. And then Cheryl Jennings met me at a public meeting. And when she found out I worked for broadcast, she said, "We're ready." She says, "Oh, I've been trying to get into radio. How did I do it?" I said, "You can come to me, work for me for free as an intern." So she did. So that's how she started, 1973. And after that, I had a total of 600 interns, unbelievable, in 20 years.
I remember trying to get a list of all of your interns for a party for you when you retired, and we had everyone's names listed on that for you. I don't know if you remember that scroll that we presented to you, but it was a challenge to find all those folks that you. I'm thinking about how many lives you've changed.
I don't know.
You're just amazing, and you haven't stopped yet. I mean, You say you retired. You're still actively involved in politics. And your husband was a major politician in San Francisco.
Yeah, he was on the Board of Supervisors in the 1960s. And let's see, then I put some notes here. Oh, Doug, at KNBR at promotion, Doug Pledger was there. And Doug was a very friendly guy on the air. You thought he was your best friend, but he didn't like the public to watch. He hated it when they came and looked through the window at him. And I took him out once to take a picture. I was promotion manager on a fire plug. And he got very nervous. And all of a sudden, he just jumped up and ran back in the building, so I didn't get to take the picture. He didn't like to be in the public. He didn't like to talk to people. On the air, he sounded like the most friendly guy in the world, but if listeners came in and looked through the window at him, he got very, he didn't like it.
What would your advice be for young people today going into any form of media?
Well, I think the first thing you do is try to get qualified by learning and managing whatever you can. Because, as I say, I took every job I ever got as a secretary, and a couple of months later I would get promoted because they realized I had the ability and the training to do what was needed. So that's the main thing, is to get qualified and be willing to start at the bottom. I think a lot of college graduates now get... I have friends who've graduated from college 3 years ago and they're still living at home. And I say, is it because you want a job at the top of your talents, or you're willing to start at the bottom? Most of them are trying, they're qualified to do something at the top, and that's where they want to be. And then there are not as many jobs nowadays, too, probably, so that's probably the other problem. So,
Do you have some other stories you wanted to tell us?
I am trying to think of what else. Well, Doug Pledger was the guy.
That was a really good story. I like that story.
Well, then Frank Dill and
Frank Dill and
Mike Cleary
yes.
there, and I handed the main thing was that the NBC decided. Well, the Federal Communications Commission decided that NBC couldn't promote its owner, RCA, that wasn't fair to use the airwaves to promote that. So we were named KNBC, and when it came KRCA in the TV station in Los Angeles had to give up its KRCA name. They thought that was more important than our radio station, so they took our KNBC down there, and we suddenly had to have a new name, and we had a program general manager in New York City who was going to name us KPO, which was the original name of KNBR. That's when it started in 1922, the KGO and KPO. And but he died of a heart attack. And the next morning, the new president decided that we would be KNBR, National Broadcast Radio, which is a silly name and it sounded bad. So I handed out 100,000 fortune cookies that said KNBC is now KNBR. We handed those out on the street every place. And it's interesting to note that when I handed out political things on the street, the women who came out of I Magnons wouldn't take them. But the minute there was food attached, they all took them. No matter how much money you had, food was attractive.
Yes, let's talk about your work.
Well, in 1968, I needed a secretary, and I tried to get, being politically oriented in that way, I tried to get a minority. Couldn't find one who had secretarial talents. So I called San Francisco State, and I said, I want somebody who types 165 words a minute and who can spell. And varied duties, as Gimme keeps reminding me when I make her do something. So she came, and she was hired. She's probably one of the first Chinese people hired in broadcasting. And she went from one job to the other, producing public affairs programs. In 1980, she started hosting them, and hosted them, I think, for 20-some years at KNBR. When NBC sold the station, the new owner kept her own. So I think she was doing that. But you might talk with her about that.
Yeah, she's really, you two were like mom and daughter. It was amazing to watch the two of you work. You thought alike at times.
I want to tell you quickly, there's only one intern I ever had to fire, and the Bob Lazich in the news department complained, and he was pretty sensible, so I thought, well, I better do that. So I went to her on a Wednesday, and I said, you know, we have to cut back on the number of interns, but could you stay till Friday? And so she said yes, she would. A month later, she called me from a little town in Texas, said she'd gone in and said she worked for NBC in San Francisco, and she was now their promotion manager.
Wow, so she did okay. A final question for you about preserving radio history and how important it is for people to know the history of radio.
Well,
what are your thoughts on that?
I read the book by John Schneider, and of course that ended before I started, because my name was Schneider before I married. Before I became a Morrison, I was Jane Schneider. My grandfather came from Germany. So,
one of the reasons that we're all here today is because we want to help preserve the California Historical Radio Museum.
Oh.
And so, you know, all this equipment, legends like yourself, and just, you know, I think it's really important. So I was wondering what your thoughts are on that for a new generation of people.
Well, radio, I think, has to continue, and unfortunately the advertising is going to the internet. Newspapers are having a tremendous problem there. And my friends will say, oh, I read the news on the internet. And I said, then you're not paying for anything for the reporters who gather that news. All the news comes from newspaper reporters. Radio stations depend on the newspaper. They hold the Chronicle up in front of them when they write the news. The TV stations do cover a few things in person, but they also depend a lot on newspaper reporters. So we need to figure out some way to support newspaper reporters.
All right. Anything else you'd like to add?
No, that's
that was
about
great.
all. Except I think it'd be interesting for you to talk to Gimme about her.
We will absolutely talk to Gimme.
Okay,
Jane, thank you
so much. Thank you very much. I enjoyed
Thank you,
it.
a pleasure. And so we are talking again on July 21st, 2012 with one of the legends of broadcasting, Jane Morrison.
And I'm very proud of Cheryl because she had a lonely beginning as an unpaid intern, but she went up because she knew what to do. And that just shows you. I said women aren't hired because they don't hire women. But if they get someone who's talented, they do promote them.
Thank you, Jane.